Your stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort, and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Chris Spurby, what a treat to get to speak with you this afternoon on the podcast, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. Thanks for taking this time.
Oh, you're welcome. The treat is mine. I remember when you first launched your podcast, I said, someday I'm going to be on Sarah's podcast, and today's the day.
I love that. It's so funny. I never would have seen myself even doing a podcast until I started talking to Neil Hughes about it. So yeah. I'm so glad you're taking the time. So the first question I always ask my guests is to share something about themselves that most people wouldn't know. And just as a little background for our listeners, Chris and I met probably 8 years ago or something, right around there on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
It's been a long time. And we started communicating back and forth pretty early on. And then when you released your book, I was one of the first to kind of jump in there and start promoting it through my LinkedIn connections because I loved it. Partly because, so Chris's book is called It's Time to Sell. And it's one of the only business books that I read more than once, and that I loved partly because it was a narrative. It wasn't a business book telling you what you should do. It was a narrative about your experience, which was very relevant to what we're going to talk about in a little bit. So I'm asking you the question about telling us something that most people might not know about you, because I would like our listeners to get to know you a little bit in a little bit different way ahead of time before we start digging into these personal stories, because it'll make them feel more connected to you like I feel connected to you.
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. And I had to think about it before we went and hit record. My head goes to the fact that I used to play guitar. And when I was in, elementary school and high school, I took guitar lessons. I actually played in a band in our church. So we had this brother. I'm a Roman Catholic, if anyone's interested in knowing that. They had in church, we had a progressive brother who decided to rally a couple of youths, one of which it was I, and we formed a band and played heavy metal music, hair metal music in church on Sunday nights at 7:30. And we used to play stuff like White Line, When the Children Cry, and War into Heaven, and all these heavy metal songs from the late 1980s, early 90s. And I remember these old ladies when in the front row, when my buddy Dave hit the drums hard, they just flew out of their seat. Anyway, I was rhythm guitar, but every now and then the guys would let me play a solo. And I'll never forget one time I was playing the solo of one of the songs, and my amplifier was up way too loud, and just blew the doors off of the church. Anyway, I ended up giving up playing guitar. If I pick up a guitar now, I can strum a few chords, but I was into it big time. My friends and I would play air guitar, thinking we were going to be rock stars and so on. But anyway, I don't know how deep you want to go into that story.
No, that's terrific.
Yeah.
It just, so the first thing that I thought of was, I didn't know that about you. And we've been talking music for a long time, for years, because I'm a musician. And I love that you used to play guitar. I'm a little bummed you kind of gave it up. But the first thought that came into my head, the first vision that came into my head was Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future, when he takes off on that like weird riff that he's doing at the concert, and it's like 1960 or something like that, and all the people in the audience just stop and stare at him like, what the heck is that?
Yeah. No, I had the mullet, the mullet, because my hair, I have really thick hair, and it's still pretty thick for my age. And my mullet used to curl up. So a mullet was the intention was to go down to your back, but mine would curl up and almost wrap around my head. Oh yeah, and I remember going to church on Sunday mornings sometimes with mom, and mom would let me express myself, and I really value that now in hindsight, because I was a big Metallica fan, and one of Metallica's earliest albums was called Kill 'Em All. And I used to go to church on Sunday mornings. Mom would let me wear my jean jacket with the big Kill 'Em All on the back.
Oh my God.
And I think about that. I think about that now, and my 18-year-old son, or would I let him do that? No, right? Anyway, it was just interesting, the stuff I used to do, and it was all centered around heavy metal music and so on.
Oh my gosh, do you know Ranjith Abraham?
No.
Okay, well, we'll have to connect you with him, and I'll put a link to one of Ranjith's recordings. He does these recordings they have musicians in India and in the US, and they are doing these amazing songs together. And he is a total metalhead. And so I'll put a link in the blog post associated with this podcast so that our listeners can hear some of what Ranjith is doing with this really cool world music. That is so funny. And you're right. Your mom letting you do that. I grew up in the synagogue, and there's no way my mother would let me wear anything related to jeans in temple when we would go on Saturday mornings. There's just no way. And wow, I like your mom already.
We're studded wristbands. Oh my God, I'm having major flashbacks now.
Did you ever use safety pins? I have this vision of people putting safety pins on everything.
Oh yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yeah. Well, that's how you used to
do a seam. Exactly. And you do like a whole seam with 100 safety pins down the seam, the back seam of your coat. Oh my gosh, the 80s.
The 80s, exactly.
That's so funny. And Back to the Future, it just popped into my head, which is a perfect reference for this. That's so funny. It actually leads really well into the theme of our conversation today. The reason I was excited to talk to you on the podcast. In your book, you talk about a story that from your past that really impacted the way you see a specific kind of person in the world and how they show up. And it was a salesperson, and that negative context that you got as a result of this one particular experience, and how you carried that with you for decades afterward. And I think about that because the reason this is a kind of a great transition into this conversation is I think about some of those images I have from the 80s and how they colored things for me, even up to a few years ago, where leggings were the thing, the long, bulky sweatshirts and leggings for girls. And when I saw them start to come back a few years back, I remember walking through the store and saying, no way, I will never go back to that look. And guess what I'm wearing today?
That's right.
But I had this total internal message about what people with leggings were like.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And I didn't wear them because, I told myself it was because it was trendy, but I didn't do it because my legs are so skinny. I thought that they would just look like chicken legs sticking out of a big sweatshirt. And I remember hearing somebody say, spandex is a privilege, not a right.
Yeah.
And I remember, so that was something that I carried it with me for decades later. So tell us a story about this salesman that really put this negative spin on that term, salesman.
Yeah. And I mean, that story has many echoes in it. But it was around 1983, a Sunday afternoon, late afternoon. and I'm out playing street hockey. I'm a Canadian, so hockey is a part of my DNA. And I went in after playing. It was a cold November day, and basically we sat down and had supper. And Mom had cooked supper. We were sitting there, and the door knocked. This is before doorbells, for the most part. Anyway, Mom gets up to answer the door, and within about 30 seconds, I could hear a male voice coming closer. And they went out into the living room of our house, and Dad then walked out. And what I witnessed over about a 15 to 20 minute time period was a demonstration by this individual of a vacuum cleaner. So it was the Electrolux vacuum cleaner salesman, and he very quickly had made his way into our living room and was doing a demonstration of the effectiveness of this vacuum cleaner. And Mom and Dad, through over the next, say, 40 minutes, they ended up buying a $3,000 vacuum, which in today's dollars is a $12,000 vacuum. And they had never even talked about this idea of buying a vacuum up until this man shows up in his brown suit, an overcoat and so on. And no matter what objection my mom and dad threw at him, he had a response for that objection. And they ended up buying it, without giving it any thought. And then they thought about the fact that they bought it for the next 3 months as they tried to figure out how to pay for it. And so that's what sales at that very young age, that was the impression. That was what I saw sales as, something you push at people, you objection fight, you sell something to somebody that they don't necessarily need just to get the sale. And so that's the story behind the Electrolux vacuum cleaner salesman, and I guess the stereotype that it created in my mind as I then moved on throughout my life.
And held on to. And even wrote this book involving that conversation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what happened with me then as I moved along and grew up, and I ended up realizing that entrepreneurship was certainly a path I wanted to go down. And as I started to build businesses, I started to realize that I was afraid to go out and sell my product or service to people. And I had to do some self-reflection. Actually had to work with a coach who kind of peeled back the layers of the onion to this exact time in my life when the definition of sales was formed in my mind when I was 10 years old. So I fell flat on my face as I started to go out there and start to sell. And I realized that I need to fix this, because I started to realize, holy smokes, all success in business is formed through creation of relationships and in turn solving problems. And so what I had to do was redefine sales for myself. And once I did that, things started to really take off for me from a business perspective and my life. I started to gain more confidence, more self-esteem, and so on. And so things really started to roll once I redefined sales for myself from where I was back in my early childhood.
So I'm imagining this man in an ugly brown polyester suit walking in your door.
Yeah, that's him.
And at that age, I mean, you're so impressionable.
Yes.
And it's funny because as you told that story, I was kind of remembering the Mary Kay saleswomen that would stop by our house when I was little, and my mom would kind of sit there and listen. And I remember thinking, I could never do that. Blah. Yeah. And especially because they always smelled of a strong perfume. And now I actually have this really negative response to Mary Kay. And they're good products, and I've heard wonderful things Fabulous about their business. But and then my mom did Tupperware for a while. And then years later, when I was in college, I developed a very visceral response to anyone trying to sell me anything.
Yes.
And I think it's a result of that. My dad did Amway for a little while. It was always kind of a network marketing pyramid scheme, get rich quick, which is something my dad, as a brilliant man who also struggled with bipolar disorder, he would jump in because he was kind of impulsive, and he thought that this was going to be his ticket. Yes. And he worked so hard, and it always surprised me that he would fall for this stuff.
Yeah.
So many he's people brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, I've really, when I hear you say that, my first exposure to sales was actually a network marketing company. And it's funny, I attribute some of the foundation for ultimately what became me today around selling to, and I'm not necessarily a proponent of network marketing, but what I'll say is they do have some great training. Some of the companies do, and because what they realize is that in order to be successful as a company, a network marketing company, average ordinary people need to jump in and have some degree of success. So they need to talk to the common denominator, and the common denominator of human beings is people. Most people are afraid to sell and afraid to get out there and make things happen. So they have great training around changing that mindset, is what I'll say to that.
And there are some great companies. I'm not bad mouthing them at all.
No.
I just remember, and that's the sad thing that we can address throughout our lives, is that we can have 10 great experiences with other companies, but we have one negative experience and suddenly all network marketing is bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, a stereotyping, absolutely. And I'm with you 100%.
Well, it even came down to a point where I went to a chiropractor for the first time. Oh, it has to be 18 years ago or something, because I was having severe sciatic pain. And I had 3 different friends say, go to Dr. Pardis. You got to try this out. It's going to really help. And I remember my mom is a nurse. So she had very negative ideas about anything outside of traditional regular medicine. So I didn't even tell her I was going, but I went. I was in such excruciating pain that every time I stepped down on my left foot, this sharp pain would just go right through my leg and into my left buttocks. And oh my gosh, my eyes would tear up. And I have super high pain tolerance. And my husband was like, you have to do something. So I went in, and he could see that I was in pretty severe pain and that I wasn't going to be able to listen to a spiel. So he said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take a couple of x-rays so I know I'm not doing damage. And then I'm going to do a treatment for you if you promise to come back tomorrow so we can talk about it.
Yeah.
And I said, if whatever you do today gives me any kind of relief for the pain I'm in, I will come back tomorrow. I promise. And he did. And he did 2 small adjustments, one on my hips and one on my upper back. And I walked out of there tight, but without excruciating pain. And I remember thinking, okay, sold. Man, if this holds.
Right?
Yeah. So then I went in the next day, and he starts to do this big long spiel about chiropractic, and it's a long-term solution, and it's not a short-term thing. And it's like pushing a truck up a hill and then letting go. It's just going to come back down the hill. And he's doing this spiel, and I stopped him. I said, you have to stop right there.
Yeah.
He said, what? And I totally interrupted him. And I realized that this poor guy, later on, after we had developed this relationship, I realized, poor guy, he's so shy that he had to do this spiel by heart. He had to memorize it in order to say it to a stranger.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was probably effective for other people, but because I had had that experience and that negative context of sales, it immediately turned me off, like vomit up in my throat kind of turned me off. That's how bad it was.
Yeah.
And I said, you've just got to stop right there. And he said, what? And I knew I had made him uncomfortable. And I said, look, if it works, I'll keep coming back.
Exactly.
You don't need to sell me on it. Just do the work and I'll keep coming back. And I stayed with him for 2 years.
Wow. Amazing story. Yeah. I mean, it shows because what he jumped into was effectively a script. So he got away from ultimately what is his genuine character, which is to serve, and felt compelled to push you through using a script, through talking about the features, and all he really had to do was stay true to himself and what he believes, and serve you and do the job, and you would have sold yourself in his presence effectively.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's amazing, and so many people fall into that trap when they have to quote unquote sell. Yeah.
Right, and that's what makes me keep coming back to your book.
Yeah.
is
Yeah,
that
that's
whole
amazing.
idea. And now as a certified strengths coach, I'm looking at your book going, oh, that makes so much more sense now, that you would figure out what you're really good at, what is meaningful to you, and
Yes.
sell using that strength, that aspect of yourself, not a script
Right.
that's not authentic to who you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. I'm really interested. I can't wait to hear more about your Strengths Finder stuff, because to me, that's just such an alignment there. If you can help people find their core strengths and what they believe and so on, all of that is what
Mhm.
sells people, right? So to me, you're on to something there. That's fabulous.
Yeah. Yeah, it's cool. I really like it. And your book is kind of my Bible for that. So just so that you know. And
Yeah,
I'm super excited to see you in a few weeks at No Longer Virtual. But
I know. Yeah.
so tell me another story about maybe a positive role model that you had in terms of sales that helped you turn that corner and particularly inspired you to write that book.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The person that comes to mind is a gentleman by the name of Joel Hunter. Joel has so when we had I was a leader in an IT consulting company. I had decided my sales was going to be my future, and I dove into sales. I called it ignorance on fire. I just went in, whatever it took to get out there, meet people, and find out what problems they had and so on. So I became very effective at sales, is what ultimately ended up happening. And I did it through visualizing myself as a good quality salesperson and so on. So what ended up happening then is we had this vision. I had a vision for growing our consulting company by leveraging the goodwill and the relationships of all of our consultants. And we were up to probably 85 or 90 at this point in time. And there was this gentleman in our community. He was actually from a different province of Canada, but he used to come to Newfoundland, and he would come in and he would invite a group of people to go out to supper, and he would sit there and just generate this genuine, authentic conversation amongst all of us. And in the process, he would walk away with millions of dollars worth of business, right? And millions of dollars may be an exaggeration, but I just want to emphasize he walked
Right.
away with just armloads of new work and so on. And I said to myself, this guy is who we have to engage to help me, the leader of sales, get all our consultants moving in that direction. So we hired Joel on a contractual basis, and he helped me form the vision for consultants getting involved in sales and the sales process and so on. And we blew up the company, and we ultimately sold it in 2013 to KPMG. But it was Joel's approach. He calls it the diagnostic conversation. Selling is nothing more than having a conversation with somebody, finding out what they want their future to look like, finding out what it currently looks like, what are the things that are holding the person back from getting to the future, and then trying to come up with ways to be helpful in bridging that gap. And that's all that sales is. And so Joel lived by example. And so when I left my job at KPMG about a year and a half ago, I said to myself, Joel is a person I need in my life. Because we had lost contact for about 10 years by this time. And I reached out to him, and the timing was perfect. He was just after retiring and so on. And so Joel and I are really close today, and we talk almost daily, and he's a true mentor, coach to me, not a coach.
Wow.
But he's a mentor of mine again today, 10 years later. So Joel Hunter is the guy who I
Joel
would,
Hunter.
yeah.
So I could tell by the way that you were telling the story about the getting people together and taking them out for supper.
Yeah.
I could tell that you had kind of this vision of like an image popped into your head of that experience. Tell me about that. So you walk into a restaurant. Is he already there waiting?
He's there waiting, and he's invited 3 or 4 people from his network there, and he doesn't
And had you met them before?
no, I live in a pretty small town and when I say small, it's about 200,000 people in my town or in my city. And, yeah,
I'm sorry, I'm chuckling because 200,000 is big by Montana standards.
Yeah. I mean, but it's an island, right? So
Right,
we
right,
don't have a lot of in and outs, if that makes sense. So
right.
a lot of people living here have lived here all our lives, and we've lived here all our lives. So we've gotten, like, the business community is fairly small, is what I'll say.
Right.
And so, yeah, so to answer your question, of the 5 or 6 people sitting at the table, I may have known 2, right?
Hmm.
And one of them maybe really well. That's probably the best way to characterize it. So yeah, we sit down, and Joel does very little talking. He just asks questions, and
Hmm.
those questions stimulate a very, and I don't know if it's his humbling personality. He has a very quirky personality. So, he may be sitting there with a big hole in his shirt. Right? Here he is, a partner with at that time, a very large multinational corporation. But he'll joke and say he only has one pair of shoes to his name, right? So he got a quirky personality, and it's that personality that allows the people there to open up and just be themselves, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, I have a very fond vision of the environment that he created, and I would suggest I have taken that model and I've applied it to my own business life and personal life in the last 3 to 5 years. Shortly after I wrote my book, I said, I'm going to start to try my hardest to become a hub within my network. And so I used that vision, that picture of Joel in my
Hmm.
mind, and tried to create the environment that he created. And I've ultimately become successful in doing that.
I love that story. I'm visualizing you sitting at this table with those people and that light
Yeah.
bulb going on at some point during the meal, just
Yeah.
observing him, and
Yeah.
and observing the reactions of the others at the table to him.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because I know you, and I know that that's kind of how you would do it, you would kind of sit there and kind of observe what's going on and have that, oh my gosh, look at what's going on here. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's an interesting point. I'm actually, I don't work. I need to be careful in how I
I
phrase
don't
this.
work.
No, I don't. I don't work
I'm just teasing.
well in groups of people. So what I have learned to do is I've learned to use that as an advantage, right? So getting a group of people together and just asking questions. Uh, Subconsciously, the people who are surrounded by on the table, they're concluding that Chris Spurvey is the hub of this grouping of people. But I'm actually not saying a whole lot. I'm just asking insightful questions, and I'm letting the conversation happen very organically. But at a subconscious level, for them, I'm seen as the organizer. So I'm seen as the leader. I don't have to try too hard. I don't have to try to do something I'm not comfortable doing, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
I just need to own my own strength, right? And that strength is asking insightful questions and listening, and maybe rephrasing what I've heard. But I don't have to be the solution to every problem sitting around that table, is what it comes down to, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I can just imagine that, just because, we've spent some time together.
yeah.
Um, and I'm reminded of that first No Longer Virtual, when you were doing that session with Heather. And
Yes.
then throughout the rest of the sessions, you would pipe up once in a while to contribute.
Yeah.
And it was always something that was insightful and thoughtful.
Yes.
And then you'd kind of be quiet again. And there, that's the thing about this group, and why you were such an integral part in it, was that I think well over half of the people there had the same kind of thing going.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The way you, what I would say is you created within this group, and you create within this group, because we're having another one in a couple of weeks. You create the Joel Hunter experience. You do. You are my modern day Joel Hunter. Yeah. So it's just a bringing of, subconsciously, you bring the right energies into the room, and you ask the insightful question that gets people to open up, and the energy kind of takes over from there, right? And it's 2 days of magic.
Well, thank you. I didn't know this was going to turn into a promo podcast.
I didn't know either, but I felt compelled to say it. I mean, that's yeah. I'm just speaking from the heart there, right?
You know what's really funny about that, Chris, is as you were talking, and I'm kind of processing what you're saying and thinking about which questions I want to ask next, because it's always generating new questions in my head. As I was listening to you, I was kind of wishing that I was Joel in terms of asking questions, and more like you, sitting back and asking questions and not being the one coming up with solutions. But I'm pretty talkative. So I'm imagining myself trying to be like that, kind of sitting back and listening and asking the right questions. And it was really hard for me to visualize myself that way, because
Interesting.
it's not really who I am.
Yeah.
But in that same breath, in that same thought, my idea turned to, if that's not you, then don't try to be like that. And your whole point in the book of finding your authentic self and doing it your own way,
yes,
is it just kind of let off an alarm in my head as I was kind of doing that internal messaging of, you need to be quieter.
Yeah.
You need to stop talking so much, which is that internal message and I'm listening to you, and I can hear that same kind of internal message for you going, you should talk more. You should try harder.
Just a flip. Yeah. I mean, you're sitting there amongst these geniuses and you're saying to yourself, I'm not one of these people. I gotta try, but all this is happening so natural for everyone else here. So anyway, I find, I got to stop telling myself that, and just I listen. Is ultimately what I think one of my core strengths is, right? And
it is.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
we just had that conversation before I hit record.
Yes. Yeah.
So tell me that story again, because I think our listeners will really appreciate it, given what we just talked about and those internal messages and how we kind of criticize ourselves to be more like somebody else.
Yeah, well, I'm so today I'm consulting with companies around their growth strategies and so on. And one of my clients is it's a health and wellness organization, and I just got back from a lunch with the owner and the new general manager that they've hired, and I'm sitting there at the lunch. As the quote unquote, and I said it to you, the high paid consultant, for lack of a better word. And that's
expert is the one that drives me crazy. I'm not an expert in anything but breathing. I'm really good at that.
Yeah. And I'm not saying the word high paid. I'm emphasizing that's exactly
right. Exactly.
Right? I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, I hope they're not expecting some glorious genius comment to come out of me, because but in my mind, I'm feeling the need to say something glorious, right? That's actually going to pay for the lunch that they're paying for. But as about 5 minutes in, 10 minutes in, I realized that I need to relieve this energy from my body and just go with the flow. And I have 15 or 16 clients. And what I'll say is they all love me for just me being me, right? And I need to remind myself of that every single morning when I wake up, because in this world we're living in, where everyone is a lot of people are putting themselves out there more. If you feel like you need to have something glorious to say every day, and I don't think that's I don't think it's what we actually need to do, right? We just got to just listen, ask insightful questions. Repeat what we've heard, and find ways to be helpful. And if we do that, then we're off to the races, is what it comes down to.
Exactly. And as a few of my friends on LinkedIn, like Zach Messler says, just do the right thing.
Yeah.
It's not that hard.
Yes.
When you have a choice to make the choice that's going to benefit the most people around you.
Yeah.
It's not that hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I love what you just said with that.
Sorry, I was just something is on my mind. There's a public speaker. He's dead now. His name was Bill Gove. At one point in time, he was believed to be one of the best speakers in the world. I think he started the National Speakers Association. I've got a recording from the 1980s, and it's called "Whatever Sets You Free." And there's a statement that he says in it: "If I'm going to be me, I've got to be free." And I love that. To me, that the energy behind that sentence, to me, if we can live by that and just be ourselves, we're going to be golden, right?
Mm-hmm. And yet we can go right back to the beginning of the conversation about who we want to be and how that changes based on some of those experiences we have, and then the internal criticisms and messages that we receive and apply for decades later, and how hard it is to change those messages.
Yeah, it is. It's like dyeing cloth, right? I mean, it takes to dye a white piece of cloth to black. It takes so much reprogramming and so on. And for me, the only way I've learned to reprogram myself is through consistent spaced repetition of a vision or an ideal of what you feel you compelled to be, for lack of a better word, right? So I still, every day, I've got my vision book, and I shouldn't be showing it because we're not actually recording the video, but I've got a vision. That's my vision, and I write that, and every 3 or 4 months I'm rewriting it, and I read it twice a day religiously, right? And I have images of the person I'm looking to be, right? And so there's me speaking in front of a group of people and so on. And anyway, so that's the only way I've learned to change those limiting beliefs that we form at a very young age.
It's consistency. I think that's why so many people use affirmations, daily affirmations.
Yeah.
Because of that, being able to change that internal messaging.
Yeah.
That makes so much sense. And I love the idea of having the visuals associated with that as well, because I'm visualizing this brown polyester suit, and if I can change that to visualize Joel with a hole in his sweater, I mean, that's a big deal. That's a big deal to me.
Yeah.
To be able to change that vision and the impression that you get as a result of that vision. And I can change that for myself across all different areas when I can. I think the key, though, is to know where that original vision came from.
Yeah.
So having, as you put it, peeling back those layers to figure out where it came from, because that's the only way you're going to be able to change it, is to dig into those stories, which is why I love what I do. Yeah. Being able to draw those stories out of people, it helps them understand better where these messages are coming from, and fighting them, or saying that's not such a bad thing.
Right.
Being able to be more intentional about it. It's not just changing a negative vision to a positive vision, but it's also seeing certain visions and changing your perspective on them and realizing with intention that wasn't such a bad vision.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's two sides of everything, right? And, if I often say that, I put up the cover of my book when I'm speaking, and I'll be looking at the back of the book, but the people in front of me are looking at the front of the book, and I'll say, "Is there a picture of me on this book?" And they'll say, "No, there's not a picture of me on the book." But I'm looking at this side of the book, and they're looking at that side of the book. There is a picture of me on the book. It's the side I'm looking at, right?
Right.
So we can flip everything. Right. Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that my head goes to, we're energetic beings, right? Like, there's energy. Someone said to me a couple of days ago that there's more energy in the human body. It can light up the city of Toronto for weeks. That's how much energy is in our bodies. And so these things that happen to us at a very young age, it's the energy behind the event. It's not just the visual. It's not just the senses. It's the energy that's in it. So I picked up on energy from my mom. I picked up on the energy of my dad. We're highly intuitive people. So it's not just what you see and what you feel, what you touch and what you taste and so on. So that's why it's so hard. It's so hard to reprogram ourselves. But like you said, sometimes we have to be just accepting of it, right? And just flip it and see how so for me, right? So I had that bad experience in 1983, but look what I've turned it into. I've turned it into a completely a career and serving 17 clients. That's a company. I have a client that's revenues have increased by 26% in 3 months as a result of in 1983, a plaid suit walking into my mom and dad's house, right? So you think about it, right? So I'm so grateful for that bad breath man in 1983 come in with the salt up and down, all up in Newfoundland. We keep the ice off our roads and with salt. So the back of his pants were all full of white salt. I'm so grateful that he came into my life. It's absolutely.
Oh my gosh, you have such a vivid memory of this man. And because I him in my eyes, like I can see him. And I'm also imagining that energy. If it was just for those 15, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, then it would have had an impact on you. But what really had that impact is you picked up the energy that your parents were putting out there.
You got it.
Afterward, in particular, when they were bickering over this ridiculously impulsive purchase.
Yes.
And that's what you hold on to, and you really associate that energy with this brown polyester plaid, bad breath, salt-covered man. And we all do that. And that's why it's so important that when you're changing that vision, if you want to see yourself doing something else, you have to actually have a visual representation of it, because there's energy associated with it. You have to have some way to apply it.
Yeah. And, so I gave 2 things that are on my mind here. Maybe I'll make this statement first. So that was a 45-minute or 35-minute experience in 1983, but actually it's been experienced a million times in my head since then. So it's actually after occupying my mind. So that's why these things are so have such an impact on us, right? We it doesn't happen just once. It happens once physically, but in our minds, it happens over and over and over.
Exactly. Every time you see somebody that's an awful salesperson.
Yeah, exactly.
It comes back to you. Wow. What an intense visual. Yeah. That's so cool. So what was the other thing you were going to?
You know what? I was just about to dive into it, and it's gone out of my head so that fast. It'll come back to me, though, I promise.
Well, it probably has something to do with experiencing it over and over again. The fact that it may have been 40 minutes, 35 minutes, but I think it's just such a relief when you do pinpoint where it came from.
Yes.
And then you can see the pattern.
Absolutely. Yeah. We are, it's amazing the way the mind works. It's an electronic switching station is what our minds are ultimately, right? And we need to treat it that way. And that's how we're impressionable people. So we need to guard very closely what we allow into our lives. But this idea of vision, when I wrote my book in 2015, the final chapter of my book is essentially the vision that I created for myself in 2015. And effectively, it has me, conducting seminars and working with groups of people. And at this point in time, when I wrote the book, I had no clue how that was going to happen in my life. And out there working with organizations, working with founders and entrepreneurs and so on. I had no idea of the how that would happen, but I put the book out into the universe, and the universe started to show me ways to make it happen, right? But if I never set the intention through the vision, I would be something else than what I am today, right? So this is why visions are so important. It's and we have a vision whether we write it down or whether we realize it or not, and we are gravitating towards the picture that we have in our brains of what we believe ourselves to be, right? So why not be purposeful about it and decide what you want to be and stay true to the vision and find ways to make it happen is what it ultimately comes down to.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
You are speaking my language right now, Chris. I'm picking
Yes,
up
and
everything
sorry.
you're dropping off.
Yeah, I remembered. So a week ago today, I was invited to speak to a group of real estate agents. We talked about energy and so on, right? And I'm up in front of the crowd, and I every now and then, because this is always so close to me, my vision, I felt the energy in the room was okay with me being vulnerable enough to read my vision. And so I started to read my vision in front of the 60 real estate agents. And in the process of reading it, meanwhile, I'm in front of all these really high quality people, and I'm reading my vision, being completely vulnerable, and I'm crying. And so I had lost complete sight of the fact that I'm on stage. I'm reading my vision, and the energy from the words are coming through me. And here I am crying, a 45-year-old man crying at the excitement and the beauty of what I believe my future is, right? So I guess I tell you that story because it just shows that we are energetic people. We're energetic beings. And if we can tap into what is ultimately our essence and what we want, what we desire to become, you forget where you are, and you're caught up in the bliss of it all. So
Flow.
anyway, I felt compelled to tell you that because I think it's proof. And when I stopped reading the vision, I wiped my eyes and said, see, there, that just goes to show that we are truly energetic beings.
So what happened afterward?
At the real estate talk?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Well, I mean, the first thing that happened was I walked home. I drove home and came home to an inbox of real estate agents, and I could read some of them to you if you wanted me to, just saying what a great talk it was and how they felt it so inspired by it, and so it was a very positively viewed presentation. But in the moment, it was very uncomfortable for me, right? Because I was doing something. I was sharing a piece of me that that I felt very scared to share. But once I got into it, I just did it. I often say, to get the energy to do the thing, we just got to do the thing. And so I just went for it. And about three minutes into my vision, or 3 words into my vision, there was no stopping me. I was just going, right?
Right. You know, what's cool about that is, well, there are a lot of things that are cool about that, but the thing that just popped into my head is I'm imagining I'm visualizing you giving this presentation in front of 60 real estate agents. And I'm imagining that some of those people were definitely uncomfortable with your level of emotion that you were demonstrating. And, and I know that because I have a tendency to be uncomfortable with other people's emotion. And I'm much better now than I used to be at recognizing when somebody needs to allow that to happen and stepping back and appreciating it, valuing it. And even if I'm uncomfortable, it's not like the discomfort goes away, but I'm more comfortable being uncomfortable with it now.
Yes.
And the beauty of what you did is that you recognized that some of those people weren't going to appreciate it. That there were a few people in that room that were probably going to be like, oh my gosh, that enough already.
Yeah.
But the rest of the people, the ones that responded and sent you emails and came up to you afterward to talk to you, to share their story and their vision, those are the people that matter.
Right. Yeah. We're not in this world to boil the ocean. We're in this world to impact the few people that we're ultimately here to serve.
The right people.
The right people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
who
cares? I mean, don't get me wrong. That's the word who cares, or the words who cares may not be, they may sound a little too raw, but who cares about the others? Let them go find their own inspiration from somebody else in some other way.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're right. Who cares? I care about the ones who need me.
Right.
I care about the ones that I can have a positive impact on without having to be somebody that I'm not.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. Yeah. So that's, it was really meaningful for me. And it's we're in this world, and we have an opportunity to create stories and have an opportunity to impact people and impact ourselves. Right. And I find for me, I try my hardest, and it's only recently I've been doing this consistently, is every evening I'll sit down for a few minutes and I'll write down a couple of little things that had an impact on me throughout that day. And that's how I can, well, number one, it's a way to show gratitude for the thing. But I think gratitude is a great energy that we should try to tap into, right? So if it wasn't for me doing that, those little small things would probably just go off and be forgotten, But if we can remember them and have them impact and tell stories about them, that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah, no, you're welcome.
I really appreciate that. That is a good one. Yeah. That's a good one to end our podcast recording on, because it's so positive, and that recognition that we're not going to connect with every single person, but when we're authentic, we'll connect with the right people.
The right people. Awesome message. I love it. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris, so much for taking the time to record this podcast with me. For our listeners, I will have a link to Chris Spurvey's LinkedIn profile so you can connect with him directly on LinkedIn. I'll have a link to his website and a link to his book, which obviously I recommend. I've given it as a gift to quite a few people, probably at least a dozen over the last 2 years. And I will have just a couple of other links associated with this blog post so that you can follow up with Chris and see more of what he's up to.
Awesome. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. And we'll be in touch.
Yeah, we will. Absolutely. See you in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going?